Okay, today we're going to look at growing the daffodils from seed. One of those things that takes a fair bit of patience. You're looking at roughly 5 years to get them to flowering, and you've got to look after them in the interim. So the question is, why would you want to do that? There's two reasons. One is that you can multiply your number of bulbs quite rapidly. If you start with, it's pretty straightforward to get 1,000 seeds, and in 5 years' time you'll have 1,000 flowering bulbs. So if you want a lot, it's one easy way to do it. The other reason is to hybridize new varieties. So every seedling you grow, unless from the species, which aren't commonly grown, if you grow any of the garden type varieties, none of them will come true to seed. So you'll get large variation in the offspring. So it can be interesting as a hobby to see what you get. You can either cross two varieties together yourself, or you can just let the bees do the work and leave them to be open pollinated and collect the seeds. So another advantage of growing them from seed is that you will get virus-free plants. So any virus in the parent plants won't be passed on to its offspring through seed, so you'll get nice, healthy, vigorous plants. So as I said, it takes about 5 years is probably the average to a flowering size bulb if you look after them. 4 years, probably a small percentage will flower after 4 years. So it's a long-term hobby, and you have to be prepared to look after them. So how many seeds can you expect per plant? Well, you're probably looking at, if they're open pollinated, you'll often not get many. You might get 4 or 5, or you might occasionally get 10 or 20. If you pollinate them yourself, you'll probably get 20 or 30 seeds per pod from one flower. And some of them can be unusually productive, and you might get 40 or 50, but probably 20 or 25 is about the average. And of those, probably 80% on average will germinate if you plant them more or less immediately. So I've got some seeds here to have a look at. As you can see, they're quite small and black, and once they're dried out, they're quite hard. So probably only a millimetre or two across. So you want to harvest the pod. So I've got a picture here of a pod that's ripe. So after pollination, it'll be a couple of months before they're ready to harvest the seed. So the pods will swell up. If they're swelling up and they don't shrivel up and die, then they've been pollinated, and you'll get viable seeds. So a couple of months after, the seeds will start to brown off. The pods, will start to brown off, and the time to pick them is either, if you give them a shake, you'll hear the seeds rattling, which means they've come loose, or if you start to see the end of the pod start to crack open, like the one in the photo, that's the time to pick them, because if you leave them much longer, they'll end up on the ground, and once they're on the ground, they're pretty hard to find because they blend in pretty well with the dirt, and usually the weeds have got underway by the time the seeds are falling. So yes, you need to keep an eye on them once they're getting near the stage of getting ripe. So the time to plant them, probably the best time to plant is immediately, as soon as you pick them, but daffodil seeds have a dormancy, so they require a warm, then a cold period to germinate. So you normally have to plant them in the summer that you collect them. They have to have that warm period first, and then in the winter following that is when they'll come through the ground. If you leave it too late and don't plant them until autumn or winter, sometimes they won't come up, and it'll be the following year before they come through. So best idea is plant them as soon as you have harvested them. So I like to plant them in boxes because they're extremely small and slow growing, and if you plant them outside, they will, unless you're meticulous with your weeding, they'll get swamped by weeds in no time, and they're very, very hard to look after. So I prefer to have them in boxes. I'll just get polystyrene fish boxes or crates, plastic crates, and I like to make sure they're reasonably deep, at least say 20 centimetres, because the bulbs will pull themselves down quite deep, and they like to be quite deep, so I like to give them room to pull themselves down. And I'll just use commercial cheap potting mix, and I'll plant them. Doesn't matter too much as long as they're around a centimetre or an inch deep or thereabouts, and just cover them with potting mix or seed raising mix, something reasonably fine, but they seem to have no trouble finding their way up. So all going well, you will see them starting to poke through and germinate, and they look like a blade of grass. And I've got some 1-year-old seedlings coming through here. They've probably been up for a couple of months, so they'll normally poke through in mid to late winter. So sometimes they'll be coming through before the bulbs start to poke through, so roughly mid-winter. You start seeing them. In the first year you'll get a single, what looks like a round cross-section blade of grass that'll be up to probably 10 centimetres high. It will come up, it will sit there, and it won't do anything else, and then it will die off in midsummer. Then the second year you'll get 1 or 2 larger leaves. They'll come up in late winter, and then they'll die down. In the third year, I've got some here that are 3 years old, you'll get 2 or 3 thicker leaves again, and same thing, they'll come up in late winter, they'll grow in the spring, and then they'll die down midsummer. So extremely slow growing when they're little, and all they're doing is the bulb's getting slightly bigger each year. So they won't be dividing, they'll be just growing a bigger bulb. And by year 4 or 5, once they've had 3 growing seasons, you can think about transplanting them out into the garden, but I prefer to leave them in the box for 4 years until the bulbs are a decent size. And you'll start to see the odd one flowering in the boxes, like the ones I've got here that are 4 years old. So in the boxes, to look after them, and the number one priority is to keep them weeded. Very easy to let them get overrun with weeds, which is why I like to grow them in boxes, and I will use new potting mix every time so it's sterile, so I don't have to deal with any weeds in the soil, only what's blowing in there, which usually it's, if you start with sterile potting mix, it's not hard to keep it weed free. Just place it somewhere where it's well away from the source of weeds, and you can weed it by hand. The most important thing is to make sure they're in full sun and that they're kept moist. Don't let them dry out during their growing season. Fertilising, I wouldn't bother too much in the first year. Your potting mix will probably have enough in it. After that, you can fertilise with general fertiliser, although it's recommended when they get near flowering stage, it's recommended not to use nitrogen, as it'll cause leaf growth at the expense of flowers, and the recommended fertiliser for daffodils is potassium, so potash is the primary fertiliser they need. So I'll just have a quick look at some seedlings. These are 5 or 6 years old, so you can see what to expect if you can look after them for that long and keep them alive. Between growing seasons, after they die down, best way to keep your boxes weed free is to just spray with Roundup or glyphosate once the leaves have fully died down, and they'll turn brown, and you can just brush the surface of the soil with your fingers to make sure there's no holes where the leaves have died down, for the spray to get down into the holes. And that's the best way to control weeds. If you spray early to midwinter, just before they start poking through, and then you can start weed free every season. Okay, got a couple of flowers here, so I'm going to have a crack at showing how to pollinate these. I've just picked these because it's easier to do it here than try and do it outside, but it goes without saying that if you pollinate flowers after you've picked them, they're not going to set seeds. They need to be on the plant. So there's a few different ways you can do this. First of all, you have to identify the sexual organs of the flower. The daffodils have both male and female on every flower. So if we look in the centre here, you can see these 6 pollen anthers with fresh pollen grains on them around the outside of the pistil. On the end of the pistil is the stigma, which is the receptacle for the pollen. So nothing's stopping you self-pollinating a flower, so I could effectively cross this with itself and it becomes the mother and the father of any seeds, but that's not commonly done, as usually leads to inbreeding. So normally you'll start with 2 parents, and I've just picked 2 random flowers here, and if you put those 2 together, you'll end up with quite a wide variation of offspring. Some will look like the mother, some will look like the father, and you'll get everything in between. So first thing to do is decide which you want to be your seed parent and which your pollen parent. So in this case I'm going to use this one for pollen and this one for seed. And I'm going to try and balance my phone here so you can see what I'm doing. So I want to get the pollen onto the stigma, which is here in the centre. So normally the easiest way to do this is to dismantle the flower first, so I can pull off these parts. And remove the petals. Alternatively to this, you can just use tweezers or a brush. So that's what I'm left with. So the pollen's all exposed, and if I put that on my finger, you'll see it's quite a lot of fresh pollen. If the pollen's coming off like that and it's yellow, it's fresh. That's good to go. And the flower you're going to be putting on the pollen, pulling the pollen onto, should be in the same state. It should have fresh pollen too, which means it will be receptive and ready to be pollinated. So easiest way is to just take this and brush those on there and get a decent amount on there. And once it's covered and yellow, you're good to go. Now you probably won't be able to see that on my camera, but on that stigma is now quite, you can see there's a good coating of pollen. So give it a couple of months, and that flower, on the back of the flower, that part is the ovary, and if your pollination has been successful, that will start to swell up. You'll end up with it be 2 or 3 times that size. The flower will die and fall away, and the ovary will remain, and eventually it will look like, once the flower's died, fallen away, it will look like that. It will swell up and get quite a lot bigger, and you'll know it's ripe when this end starts to crack open and it'll turn brown, and you better rattle the seeds.